The thundering hooves of a chestnut stallion pounded against the dusty trail as Garrett James rode into the small town of Silverwater Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1878. The sun hung low in the western sky, painting the horizon with streaks of orange and purple that silhouetted the distant mountains. Garrett pulled his hat lower over his eyes, shielding them from the setting sun and the curious glances of townspeople who paused to observe the newcomer. At 32 years old, Garrett had spent most of his life drifting from one frontier town to another, never staying long enough to put down roots. The war had changed him, leaving him with scars both visible and hidden. The visible one stretched from his left temple to his jaw, a permanent reminder of a Confederate saber. The invisible ones ran deeper, manifesting in his reluctance to connect with others, to share more than a passing moment of conversation over whiskey. He guided his horse toward the livery stable, his lean frame shifting easily with the animal's movements. His worn leather vest, faded blue shirt, and dusty denim pants marked him as a working cowboy, not one of those fancy types from back east who came west with romantic notions of frontier life. "Evening," the stable boy called out as Garrett dismounted. "New in town. Just passing through," Garrett replied, his voice low and graveled from too many days on the trail. He handed over a coin. "Take good care of him. He's had a long ride." "Yes, sir. Name's Tommy, if you need anything else." Garrett nodded, retrieved his saddlebags, and headed toward the hotel. Silverwater Creek wasn't much different from a dozen other towns he'd seen in his travels. A main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a general store, a saloon, a small church at one end, and the inevitable brothel discreetly positioned at the town's edge. What he needed now was a hot bath, a decent meal, and a bed that wasn't the hard ground. The Silverwater Hotel was a two-story clapboard building with peeling white paint and a wide porch. Inside, a balding man with spectacles looked up from his ledger. "Room for the night," Garrett said, placing coins on the counter. "Just you?" the clerk asked, pushing the register toward him. "Just me," Garrett confirmed, signing his name with a quick scrawl. "Room 4, top of the stairs, first door on your right. Bath's extra, but we've got hot water ready if you're interested." "I'll take it." An hour later, clean-shaven and wearing his last clean shirt, Garrett made his way to the town's busiest saloon, the Silver Dollar. The piano music and laughter spilled out onto the street, a stark contrast to the quiet solitude he'd known on the trail. He hesitated at the swinging doors, momentarily reconsidering, but his empty stomach drove him forward. The saloon was crowded, filled with the usual mix of cowboys, miners, and townspeople. Garrett found a corner table with his back to the wall, ordered a whiskey and a plate of whatever was cooking, and settled in to observe. It was a habit formed during the war and reinforced by years on the frontier: always know your surroundings, always have an exit. "You look like you could use company," said a painted woman sidling up to his table. Her red dress was cut low, revealing more than it concealed. "Just the food, madam," Garrett replied politely but firmly. She shrugged and moved on to more promising prospects. The whiskey arrived, followed shortly by a surprisingly decent plate of beef stew and bread. Garrett ate slowly, savoring real food after weeks of trail rations. As he ate, he listened to the conversations around him, picking up bits of local news and gossip. New school teacher arriving tomorrow. Cattle prices dropping again. Barn dance Saturday night at the Peterson place. The last comment caught his ear. A group of young cowboys at the next table were discussing the upcoming event with enthusiasm. "Miss Rebecca's organizing it," one said. "Heard she's making those apple pies of hers." "Worth going just for that," another agreed. Though I'm more interested in seeing if she'll save me a dance. In your dreams, Cooper. She's too fine a lady to waste time with the likes of you." They laughed, and Garrett turned his attention back to his meal. Dances weren't for men like him. He'd attended one years ago before the war when he was still young and full of hope. That was before he'd seen men torn apart by cannon fire, before he'd killed other men simply because they wore different colored uniforms, before he'd lost everything and everyone that mattered. The next morning, Garrett considered his options. He had enough money to continue his journey, but his horse needed rest, and truthfully, so did he. He decided to stay a few days, maybe look for work to replenish his funds before moving on. At the general store, he purchased supplies while listening to the conversations around him. The store was busy, filled with women buying last-minute items for the barn dance and men pretending they weren't interested in such frivolities. "Garrett James, is that you?" The voice came from behind him, familiar yet distant, like an echo from another life. Garrett turned to find an older man with a silver-streaked beard and weathered face staring at him in disbelief. "Samuel Miller," Garrett said, recognition dawning. "Been a long time." "8 years at least," Samuel agreed, clapping him on the shoulder. "Not since we drove that herd to Kansas together. What brings you to Silverwater Creek?" "Just passing through," Garrett replied, his standard answer. Samuel shook his head. "Always were a man of few words. Listen, I own a small spread outside town now. Could use a good hand for a few weeks. The pay's fair, and there's a bunkhouse with your name on it if you're interested." Garrett considered the offer. A few weeks of steady work would fill his pockets, and Samuel had been a good trail boss back in the day, fair and straightforward. "Might be," Garrett allowed. "What kind of work?" "Got a new string of horses need breaking, some fence mending, general ranch work. Nothing you can't handle." "When do you need me to start?" Samuel grinned. "How about now? I've got the wagon outside." And just like that, Garrett had a job and a temporary home. The Miller Ranch was modest by Wyoming standards, a few hundred acres, a small herd of cattle, and the horses Samuel bred and trained for sale. The work was hard but honest, exactly what Garrett needed. By Saturday, he'd settled into a routine. Up before dawn, working with the horses, mending fences, and whatever else needed doing. Samuel's wife, Martha, kept the men well fed, and their daughter Eliza, now married with children of her own, often visited with freshly baked goods. "You coming to the dance tonight?" Samuel asked as they finished the evening chores. "Not my kind of entertainment," Garrett replied. "Ah, come on, the whole town will be there. Good food, good music. Might do you good to socialize a bit." "I'll pass," Garrett said firmly. "Someone should stay with the stock anyway." Samuel didn't push, but Martha did, setting a clean shirt on Garrett's bunk with a note suggesting he might reconsider. Garrett folded the shirt neatly and placed it in his saddlebag. He appreciated the gesture, but his mind was made up. As dusk fell, Samuel, Martha, and the other ranch hands departed for the Peterson barn, leaving Garrett alone with his thoughts and the livestock. He made his usual rounds, checking on a mare about to foal, then settled on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The distant sound of music carried on the night air, reminding him of other times, other places. For a moment, he allowed himself to remember dancing with Mary Elizabeth Cooper at the county fair back in Kentucky, before the war tore the country apart. She'd had blonde hair and laughing eyes, and he'd been young enough to believe in forever. She'd married someone else while he was away fighting and died in childbirth before he returned. Just one more loss in a war full of them. The sound of an approaching wagon pulled him from his memories. It was unusual for anyone to visit the ranch this late, especially with the dance in full swing. Garrett set his coffee aside and moved his hand closer to the revolver at his hip. The wagon came into view, driven by a woman alone. This was even more unusual and potentially concerning. Women didn't typically travel alone after dark in these parts. "Hello, the house," she called out, bringing the wagon to a stop in the yard. "Is anyone home?" Garrett stepped into the light cast by the porch lantern. "Evening, madam. Can I help you?" She set the brake and gathered her skirts to descend. "I'm looking for Samuel Miller. I'm Rebecca Blackburn, the schoolteacher." Garrett moved forward to offer assistance. "They've gone to the dance at Peterson's barn. I'm Garrett James, work for Miller." As she stepped down from the wagon, the lantern light illuminated her features. She was younger than he'd expected, perhaps mid-20s, with rich auburn hair pinned up beneath a sensible bonnet. Her traveling dress was plain but well-made, dusty from the road. "Oh, of course, the dance," she said, looking chagrined. "I'd forgotten in all the rush to get here. My stage was delayed in Cheyenne." "You're welcome to wait for them," Garrett offered. "They shouldn't be too late." Rebecca hesitated, glancing at the house. "I hate to impose, but I've been traveling for days. Is there somewhere I might freshen up?" Garrett felt a moment of panic. He wasn't accustomed to entertaining ladies, let alone being alone with them in someone else's home. But frontier hospitality demanded certain courtesies. "Of course. Martha would skin me alive if I left you sitting in the yard. Come inside and I'll show you where things are." He led her into the house, lighting lamps as they went. "Kitchen's through there. Pumps out back if you need water. Martha's room is upstairs, first door on the left. I'm sure she wouldn't mind you using her things to freshen up." "Thank you, Mr. James. You're very kind." "Garrett," he corrected automatically, then wondered why he'd done so. Rebecca smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes. "Garrett, then. And I'm Rebecca, not Miss Blackburn unless we're in school." He nodded awkwardly. "I'll be out on the porch if you need anything." Garrett retreated to his coffee, now cold, and poured a fresh cup. The arrival of the schoolteacher had disrupted his quiet evening, and he wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation. Still, he couldn't very well send her off to find the dance on her own. About 20 minutes later, Rebecca emerged from the house, looking refreshed. She'd removed her bonnet, revealing more of her auburn hair, and had clearly washed the dust of travel from her face and hands. "Much better," she said, joining him on the porch. "I feel human again." Garrett offered her his chair, but she declined, opting to lean against the porch railing. "I don't want to disturb your evening any more than I already have. I'm sure I can find my way to the Peterson place." "Wouldn't be proper to let you go alone," Garrett said, surprising himself. "I can take you." Rebecca studied him. "You weren't planning to attend the dance yourself?" "No, madam." "Then I won't force you. I'm perfectly capable, it's no trouble," Garrett interrupted. "Just give me a minute to saddle the horses." Before she could protest further, he was striding toward the barn. It would be a simple matter to escort her to the dance, and then return to his solitude. Samuel would understand someone needed to keep an eye on the pregnant mare anyway. They rode side by side down the moonlit trail, Rebecca on Martha's gentle mare and Garrett on his chestnut. The night was clear, stars scattered across the vast Wyoming sky like diamonds on black velvet. "It's beautiful here," Rebecca commented. "So different from Boston." "You're from the East?" Garrett asked, making conversation to fill the silence. "Born and raised. This is my first time west of the Mississippi." She laughed softly. "My parents think I've lost my mind coming out here to teach in a frontier town." "What made you do it?" Rebecca was quiet for a moment. "I wanted something different, something real. In Boston, everything was so prescribed, especially for women. Marry well, have children, host tea parties. I wanted more." Garrett nodded, understanding the desire for something different, even if his own journey had been driven by a need to escape memories rather than societal expectations. "And you?" Rebecca asked. "Have you always been a cowboy?" "More or less," Garrett replied. "Grew up on a small farm in Kentucky. Worked cattle drives after the war, been drifting ever since." "The war," she echoed softly. "You fought?" "Union cavalry," he said shortly, not wanting to elaborate. Rebecca seemed to sense his reluctance. "My brother fought too, he didn't come home." The simple statement hung between them, laden with unspoken grief. Garrett didn't offer condolences. They both knew how hollow such words could be. As they approached the Peterson farm, the sounds of music and laughter grew louder. Lanterns hung from the barn eaves, casting a warm glow over the yard where couples danced beneath the stars while others gathered around tables laden with food and drink. Garrett helped Rebecca dismount, then tethered the horses to a hitching post. "I'll leave you here," he said, already planning his retreat. "You won't stay?" she asked, looking genuinely disappointed. "Even for a little while, not much for dancing," Garrett replied, touching the brim of his hat. "You'll be fine now. Samuel and Martha will see you home." Rebecca looked like she might argue, but just then, Martha spotted them and hurried over, exclaiming over the new arrival. In the ensuing flurry of introductions and explanations, Garrett slipped away, mounting his horse and heading back to the ranch. But as he rode, the music followed him, carried on the night breeze, and he found himself thinking of auburn hair and intelligent eyes that had looked at him with interest rather than pity or wariness. The following days brought a return to routine, though Garrett found his thoughts occasionally straying to the schoolteacher. He saw her from a distance in town when he went to pick up supplies, but made no effort to approach her. She was surrounded by townspeople, clearly well received in her new position. A week after the dance, Samuel announced that the annual cattle drive to Cheyenne would begin in 3 days. "Could use you, Garrett, if you're willing," he said. 2 weeks there and back, good pay." Garrett agreed readily. The open range and simple demands of the trail were familiar territory, unlike the complex emotions that had begun to stir whenever he thought about Rebecca Blackburn. The day before their departure, Garrett was in town, purchasing personal supplies for the journey when a familiar voice called his name. He turned to find Rebecca approaching, a basket over her arm and a smile on her face. "Mr. James Garrett," she corrected herself. "I've been hoping to see you. I wanted to thank you properly for your assistance the other night." "No need for thanks," Garrett said, suddenly aware of how dusty and unkempt he must look. "Anyone would have done the same. Nevertheless, I appreciate it." She paused, then continued more hesitantly. "I was also hoping you might consider a favor." Garrett raised an eyebrow. "What kind of favor?" "I'm organizing a small exhibition for my students, a demonstration of frontier skills. Riding, roping, that sort of thing. Samuel has already agreed to help, but I could use another experienced hand. It would only be for an afternoon once you return from the cattle drive." The request surprised him. "I'm not much good with children, Miss Blackburn." "I've seen you with horses," she countered. "Anyone who has that kind of patience would do fine with children. And it's Rebecca, remember." Before Garrett could formulate a refusal, Samuel appeared, clapping him on the shoulder. "There you are. Martha's invited Rebecca to dinner tonight before we leave. You'll join us, of course." Trapped by courtesy and Samuel's assumption, Garrett found himself agreeing to both the dinner and, somewhat reluctantly, the school exhibition. Rebecca's pleased smile shouldn't have affected him as much as it did. Dinner at the Miller Ranch that evening was a livelier affair than usual. Martha had outdone herself with roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and apple pie. The conversation flowed easily, with Rebecca sharing stories of her journey west and her first impressions of Silverwater Creek. The children are wonderful, she was saying. So eager to learn, so different from the city children I taught in Boston. They have a self-reliance that's quite remarkable. Frontier living breeds that, Samuel observed. Kids here learn early that life doesn't hand you much without hard work. That's precisely why I wanted to organize the exhibition, Rebecca explained. To celebrate those skills, to show the children that what they know has value, even as they learn reading and arithmetic. Garrett, who had been quiet for most of the meal, found himself unexpectedly drawn into the conversation. What exactly did you have in mind for this exhibition? Rebecca turned to him, clearly pleased by his interest. Demonstrations of roping, riding, maybe some tracking skills. Perhaps a display of local crafts, quilting, leather work, and I thought we might end with a small social gathering, some music and dancing for the community. Sounds like a fine idea, Martha approved. The children will love it and so will their parents. I've never been much good at public exhibitions, Garrett admitted. You don't have to do anything complicated, Rebecca assured him. Just share what you know. The children will be impressed simply because you're a real cowboy. The way she said it, with genuine respect rather than the romanticized notion many Easterners had of cowboys, caught Garrett off guard. This woman saw the West for what it was: hard, demanding, but rewarding in its own way. I'll think about what might be appropriate, he conceded. The cattle drive departed the next morning, 20 men driving 200 head toward the railhead at Cheyenne. Garrett found the familiar work soothing: long days in the saddle, nights under the stars, the rhythm of the herd setting the pace of life. It was simple, straightforward, with clear dangers and solutions. Yet in quiet moments, when the cattle were settled and the night watch assigned, he found his thoughts drifting to auburn hair and intelligent conversation. He told himself it was merely the novelty of meeting an educated woman in these parts, nothing more. The drive was successful, the cattle fetching a good price despite the declining market. Samuel paid the men well, and they began the journey home in high spirits. Garrett had earned enough to continue his travels if he chose, to move on as he always did. But for the first time in years, the thought of leaving brought no relief, only a strange hollowness. They returned to Silverwater Creek on a Friday afternoon, tired and dusty, but satisfied with their work. As they rode down the main street, Garrett spotted Rebecca emerging from the schoolhouse with a group of children. She saw them too, waving cheerfully before turning her attention back to her students. "Dinner at our place tomorrow," Samuel told the men as they dispersed. "To celebrate a successful drive. And don't forget, school exhibition next Saturday. All hands expected." Garrett nodded, already mapping out what he might demonstrate that would be appropriate for children. Perhaps basic roping techniques, something useful but not too difficult for them to try themselves. Saturday evening found the Miller Ranch filled with ranch hands and their families, celebrating the drive's success. Garrett, freshly bathed and wearing his cleanest shirt, found himself scanning the gathering for Rebecca. She arrived with the town doctor and his wife, her auburn hair arranged more elaborately than he'd seen before, her green dress bringing out the color of her eyes. "Garrett," she greeted him warmly. "Welcome back. How was the drive?" "Successful," he replied. "No major problems. Samuel was telling me about a river crossing that sounded rather harrowing." Garrett shrugged. "Just part of the job." Rebecca studied him. "You don't take credit easily, do you? For any of it the war, your skills with horses, even a successful river crossing." The observation made him uncomfortable in its accuracy. Not much to take credit for, just doing what needs doing. Before she could respond, Martha called everyone to dinner, and the conversation shifted to general topics. Garrett found himself seated across from Rebecca, and despite his usual reticence, he joined in occasionally, drawn by her genuine interest in the people and customs of the West. After dinner, someone produced a fiddle and impromptu dancing began in the cleared living room. Garrett retreated to the porch, his habitual position on the periphery of social gatherings. He wasn't surprised when Rebecca eventually found him there, not dancing. She asked, joining him at the porch railing. "Not much for dancing," he repeated his statement from the barn dance night. "Because you don't enjoy it or because you don't know how?" She challenged gently. Garrett looked at her, surprised by her directness. "Known how since I was a boy. Just lost the taste for it." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. "The war took many things from many people," she said finally. "My brother used to play the piano, beautiful music. After he died, I couldn't bear to hear it for years. But then I realized that by avoiding the music, I was losing something else he'd given me." The insight struck uncomfortably close to home. How many things had Garrett avoided, cut himself off from in an effort to avoid pain? "It's just dancing," he said, more gruffly than he intended. "Is it?" Rebecca's gaze was searching. "Or is it allowing yourself a moment of joy, of connection, the kind of simple pleasure that reminds us we're alive?" Before he could formulate a response, she held out her hand. "Dance with me, Garrett. Just one dance, here on the porch if you prefer, away from everyone else." He stared at her outstretched hand, feeling something shift inside him. It would be easy to refuse, to maintain the careful distance he'd kept from the world for so long. But something in her eyes, not pity, but understanding, and perhaps a reflection of his own loneliness, made him hesitate. "One dance," he said finally, taking her hand. The fiddle music drifted through the open windows as Garrett placed his hand respectfully at Rebecca's waist. They moved together in the simple steps of a waltz, there on the porch under the stars. At first, Garrett was stiff, hyper-aware of her proximity, but gradually the familiar rhythm took over. It had been so long since he'd touched another person this way, with gentleness rather than necessity. "See," Rebecca said softly. "Not so terrible after all." And it wasn't. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Garrett felt something like peace. The walls he'd built around himself didn't crumble, but perhaps a small window had opened, letting in a breath of fresh air. When the music ended, they stepped apart, but something had changed between them. A connection had formed, tenuous but real. "Thank you," Rebecca said simply. Garrett nodded, unable to find words for what he was feeling. But when she turned to go back inside, he surprised himself by asking, "Will you be at church tomorrow?" She looked back, a smile lighting her face. "Yes, will you?" "Might be," he replied, which was more than he'd considered in years. The following week passed quickly, with Garrett dividing his time between ranch work and preparing for the school exhibition. He found himself looking forward to the event, planning what he would demonstrate and gathering the necessary equipment. He even attended Sunday services, sitting in the back pew, but present nonetheless. Rebecca had smiled when she saw him, a simple acknowledgement that warmed him more than it should have. The day of the exhibition dawned clear and mild, perfect weather for an outdoor event. The schoolyard had been transformed, with areas set up for different demonstrations and displays of frontier crafts. Children and parents began arriving early, excitement evident in their faces. Garrett set up his station, arranging lariats of different sizes, including smaller ones he'd made specifically for the children to try. Samuel had brought several docile horses for the riding demonstration, and other local craftsmen and women had set up displays of their work. Rebecca moved through the gathering, greeting everyone, her face alight with enthusiasm. When she reached Garrett, she paused. "This is wonderful," she said, gesturing to his careful arrangements. The children will be so excited to learn from a real cowboy. Hope I don't disappoint them, Garrett replied, suddenly nervous. Rebecca laid her hand briefly on his arm. You won't. Just be yourself. The day progressed better than Garrett had anticipated. The children were eager learners, their natural curiosity overcoming his initial awkwardness. He showed them how to hold a lariat, how to form the loop, how to time the throw. When a small boy successfully roped a fence post after several attempts, his face lit up with such pride that Garrett couldn't help smiling in return. Mr. James is smiling. The boy announced to everyone in earshot, causing a ripple of laughter. A rare sight indeed, Samuel called out good-naturedly. Throughout the day, Garrett found his gaze repeatedly drawn to Rebecca as she moved among the various demonstrations, encouraging the children, thanking the adults who had contributed. She had a natural grace with people of all ages, a genuine interest that drew them to her. As the afternoon waned, the exhibitions gave way to a community supper, followed by music and dancing in the cleared schoolyard. Garrett helped set up tables, then retreated to his customary position on the sidelines. But his eyes kept finding Rebecca in the crowd, watching as she danced with various partners: Samuel, the doctor, several fathers of her students. When the music paused and the musicians took a break, Rebecca made her way to where Garrett stood. "You're not going to make me come find you on the porch again, are you?" she asked, her tone teasing but her eyes serious. Garrett looked at her, at the woman who had somehow seen past his carefully constructed defenses to the man he used to be, the man he might be again. Without a word, he held out his hand. Rebecca's smile was worth every moment of discomfort as they joined the other dancers. This time, there was no hesitation in his steps, no awkward stiffness. They moved together as if they'd been dancing for years, his hand sure at her waist, hers warm on his shoulder. "You're very good at this for someone who doesn't dance," Rebecca observed. "Had a good teacher recently," Garrett replied, surprising himself with the ease of the banter. They danced again and then again, until Garrett lost count. He was vaguely aware of curious glances, of Samuel's knowing smile, but mostly he was aware of Rebecca, the way she fit perfectly in his arms, the scent of lavender in her hair, the way her eyes never left his face. When the evening finally wound down and families began to depart, Garrett offered to see Rebecca home. They walked slowly through the quiet streets, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "Thank you for today," she said. "The children learned so much, and they adored you." "I enjoyed it more than I expected," Garrett admitted. "They're good kids. Children usually are when given the chance." She paused outside the small house she rented from the doctor's family. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" Garrett hesitated. Being alone with her in her home was different from a public gathering or even the miller's house. It suggested possibilities he wasn't sure he was ready to consider. Rebecca seemed to read his thoughts. "Just coffee, Garrett, and perhaps conversation. I enjoy talking with you." He found himself nodding, following her inside to the neat, simply furnished front room. Rebecca lit a lamp and gestured for him to take a seat while she prepared the coffee in the adjoining kitchen. "I've been meaning to ask," she said as she worked. "What are your plans now that the cattle drive is over? Samuel mentioned you usually move on after a job is finished." The question caught Garrett off guard, though he'd been asking himself the same thing. "Haven't decided yet," he said honestly. "Might stay on a while longer." Rebecca returned with 2 cups of coffee sitting across from him. "I'd be glad if you did," she said simply. The directness of her statement, the honesty in her eyes, struck Garrett deeply. This woman didn't play games or hide behind social niceties. She spoke her mind even when it made her vulnerable. "Why?" he asked, needing to understand. Rebecca considered her answer carefully. "Because when I'm with you I feel Seen, not as the new school teacher or the woman from Boston, but as myself. And because I think perhaps you feel the same way with me." The accuracy of her perception was startling. Garrett had spent years making himself invisible, fading into the background of whatever town or ranch he passed through. But with Rebecca he felt solid, present in a way he hadn't in a very long time. "I'm not an easy man to know," he warned. "Got a lot of rough edges." "I'm not looking for easy," she replied. "I'm looking for real." They talked late into the evening, sharing stories from their lives, discovering connections and differences. Garrett found himself speaking of things he rarely mentioned: his family in Kentucky, some of the better memories from before the war, the dreams he'd once had for a place of his own. When he finally rose to leave, they stood facing each other in the soft lamplight. Garrett knew he should simply bid her good night, but something held him there, drawn to her in a way he couldn't explain. "Rebecca," he began, uncertain what he meant to say. She stepped closer, looking up at him with those clear green eyes. "Yes." Instead of words, Garrett found himself leaning down, brushing his lips against hers in a kiss so gentle it barely qualified as such. He pulled back immediately, apology ready on his lips, but Rebecca's smile stopped him. "I was hoping you might do that," she said softly. Garrett walked back to the ranch that night with his mind in turmoil, yet underneath the confusion was a current of something that felt strangely like hope. He'd kissed Rebecca Blackburn, and the world hadn't ended. In fact, it felt as if it might be beginning again. The next few weeks brought changes to Garrett's life that he could never have anticipated. He stayed on at the Miller Ranch, taking on more responsibilities as Samuel began to trust him with greater aspects of the operation. He attended church regularly, usually sitting beside Rebecca. They rode together on Sunday afternoons, exploring the countryside around Silverwater Creek, talking about everything and nothing. In town, people began to treat him differently, not as the drifter passing through, but as a permanent fixture. The general store owner extended credit. The barber asked about ranch business. Children from Rebecca's school waved and called out greetings when they saw him. And through it all, his relationship with Rebecca deepened. They moved slowly, both aware of the scrutiny of small-town life. Their kisses grew more confident, their conversations more intimate, but they maintained the proprieties expected of a courting couple. One evening in late October, as they sat on Rebecca's porch watching the sunset, Garrett found himself talking about the future, something he hadn't done in years. "Samuel's offered me a partnership," he said. "A small stake in the ranch to start, with the option to buy more over time." Rebecca turned to him, her face alight with pleasure. "Garrett, that's wonderful. Are you going to accept?" "Been thinking about it," he admitted. "It's a good offer. Samuel's getting older, could use someone to take on more of the physical work, and it's a fine piece of land." "You'd be staying in Silverwater Creek," Rebecca observed, her tone carefully neutral despite the hope in her eyes. Garrett took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her softer skin. "That's the main appeal," he said honestly. "Being near you." The smile that bloomed on her face was worth every moment of vulnerability the admission cost him. "I'm very glad to hear that," she said softly. "There's something else I've been considering," Garrett continued, his heart pounding uncomfortably. "Something I'd like your opinion on." "Of course." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, holding it in his closed fist for a moment, before opening his hand to reveal a simple gold ring set with a small pearl. "It was my mother's," he explained. "Only thing I have left of hers." "Not fancy, but it's beautiful," Rebecca interrupted, her eyes wide. "Rebecca," Garrett said, his voice steadier than he felt, "I know we haven't known each other long, and I'm not much of a catch, too old, too scarred, too set in my ways. But if you'd consider—" That is, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. Yes, she said simply. Yes, Garrett James, I will marry you. He slipped the ring onto her finger, marveling at how right it looked there, then drew her into his arms for a kiss that sealed their promise to each other. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church, with Samuel standing as Garrett's best man and Martha helping Rebecca prepare. The schoolchildren formed an honor guard outside the church, throwing flower petals as the newlyweds emerged. At the reception held in the Peterson barn, the same barn where Garrett had refused to dance months before he surprised everyone by leading his bride onto the floor for the first dance, moving with a confidence and joy that few had ever seen in him. "You've created a scandal," Rebecca teased as they waltzed. "The townspeople won't know what to think, seeing the stoic Mr. James smiling and dancing." "Let them talk," Garrett replied, pulling her closer than was strictly proper. "I've got better things to do than worry about gossip." They made their home in a small cabin on the Miller Ranch, which Garrett expanded over the winter months, adding a second bedroom and a larger kitchen. Rebecca continued teaching, riding to and from the schoolhouse each day, her enthusiasm for education undiminished by marriage. Spring brought new life to the ranch calves, foals, and the first plantings in Rebecca's kitchen garden. Garrett worked from dawn to dusk, helping with calving, training horses, mending winter damage to fences and outbuildings. But each evening, he returned to a home filled with warmth and conversation, to a woman who looked at him as if he were the answer to every question she'd ever asked. One evening in late May, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Rebecca took his hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "We'll need that second bedroom sooner than we thought," she said softly. Garrett stared at her, comprehension dawning slowly. We're going to have a baby," she confirmed, her eyes searching his face. "Around Christmas, the doctor thinks." For a moment, Garrett couldn't speak, overwhelmed by emotions he couldn't name. Fear, certainly the frontier was hard on women in childbirth, but also a fierce, protective joy that took his breath away. "A baby," he repeated, his voice rough with feeling. "Our baby." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears at his expression. "Are you happy?" In answer, Garrett gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of the most precious glass. "More than I ever thought possible," he whispered against her hair. "More than I deserve." "Nonsense," Rebecca countered, pulling back to look at him. "You deserve every happiness, Garrett James, and I intend to spend my life making sure you receive it." The months that followed were busy ones. Garrett threw himself into preparing for the baby's arrival, building a cradle, setting aside money for the future, making plans with Samuel to increase his stake in the ranch. Rebecca continued teaching until November, when Martha insisted she rest during the final weeks of her pregnancy. Winter came early that year, with snow blanketing the Wyoming landscape by mid-November. Garrett worried about the weather, about the distance to the doctor's house, about everything that might go wrong. Rebecca bore his concern with good-humored patience, assuring him that women had been having babies since the beginning of time, usually with far fewer advantages than she had. On Christmas Eve, with snow falling gently outside their snug cabin, Rebecca went into labor. Garrett sent one of the ranch hands for the doctor and Martha, then returned to his wife's side, terrified but determined not to show it. "Tell me what to do," he said, taking her hand. Rebecca, her face already flushed with effort, smiled up at him. "Just be here. That's all I need." The labor was long, stretching through the night and into Christmas morning. Garrett never left Rebecca's side, supporting her through each contraction, wiping her brow, murmuring encouragement. The doctor arrived, and Martha, bringing practical experience and medical knowledge that Garrett lacked. And finally, as the sun rose on Christmas Day, their daughter was born a tiny, perfect being with a dusting of auburn hair and her father's determined chin. "She's beautiful," Rebecca whispered, exhausted but radiant as she held their child for the first time. "Like her father." "Like her mother," Garrett countered, his voice thick with emotion as he gazed at the two most important people in his world. "What shall we call her?" Rebecca considered, looking down at the infant who had already captured their hearts. "Grace," she decided. "Grace Mary James." "Perfect," Garrett agreed, gently touching his daughter's tiny hand. To his amazement, her fingers curled around his, holding on with surprising strength for one so small. As the doctor and Martha discreetly withdrew, leaving the new family to their private joy, Garrett sat on the edge of the bed, one arm around his wife, the other helping to support their daughter. "I never thought I'd have this," he admitted quietly. "After the war, I convinced myself I didn't deserve a family, happiness, any of it. I was just existing." "And now?" Rebecca asked, leaning against him. Garrett looked at his wife, at their daughter, at the home they had created together. "Now I'm living," he said simply. "Really living for the first time in years." Rebecca smiled up at him, understanding in her eyes. "All because you decided to dance with me that night." "Best decision I ever made," Garrett agreed, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside the cabin, warmth and love created a haven against the winter chill. Garrett James, once a drifting cowboy who refused to dance, had found his place in the world not on the endless trails of the West, but in the arms of a woman brave enough to take his hand and show him the way home. 5 years later, the Miller James Ranch had become one of the most prosperous in the territory. Samuel had gradually stepped back, allowing Garrett to take the lead in day-to-day operations while retaining an advisory role. The partnership had flourished, benefiting from Samuel's experience and Garrett's tireless work ethic. Rebecca continued teaching, though now she only taught 3 days a week, devoting the rest of her time to their growing family. Grace, now 5, was joined by 3-year-old Samuel William and 1-year-old Elizabeth Martha. The cabin had been expanded again, becoming a proper ranch house with a large kitchen, separate bedrooms for the children, and a small study where Rebecca prepared her lessons, and Garrett kept the ranch accounts. Life had settled into a rhythm that would have been unimaginable to the man who rode into Silverwater Creek all those years ago. Mornings began early, with Garrett and Rebecca sharing coffee before the children woke, planning their day together. Evenings ended with family time reading, music, or simply sitting on the porch watching the sunset. On a warm June evening, as they celebrated their 6th wedding anniversary, Rebecca presented Garrett with a gift, a framed photograph of their family, taken by a traveling photographer who had passed through town the previous month. "To remind you of how far we've come," she said as he unwrapped it. Garrett studied the image, Rebecca seated with Elizabeth on her lap, Grace and Samuel standing on either side of her, and himself standing behind them, one hand resting on Rebecca's shoulder. They looked happy, solid, connected in a way that still sometimes amazed him. "I don't need reminding," he said, setting the photograph carefully on the mantel. "I count my blessings every day." Rebecca smiled, the same smile that had first drawn him in, that still had the power to warm him from the inside out. "Do you ever think about that night at the Peterson barn, when you refused to dance?" "Often," Garrett admitted. "I think about how close I came to missing all of this." He gestured to their home, their children playing nearby, the life they'd built together. "I'm glad I was persistent," Rebecca said, slipping her hand into his. "Stubborn, you mean?" Garrett teased, bringing her hand to his lips. Perhaps, she conceded. But it worked out rather well, wouldn't you say? In answer, Garrett pulled her to her feet and into his arms, beginning to sway to music only they could hear. Rebecca followed his lead, her body fitting perfectly against his as they danced in their living room, surrounded by the evidence of their shared life. "Very well indeed," Garrett murmured against her hair. "I haven't sat down since," and it was true. From the moment, Rebecca Blackburn had taken his hand and led him onto that dance floor. Garrett James had been in constant motion, building a home, raising a family, living fully in each moment instead of merely passing through life as an observer. The cowboy who had refused to dance had learned that life itself was a dance, sometimes fast and chaotic, sometimes slow and measured, but always better when shared with a partner who matched your steps and held on tight when the music changed. As the sun set on another day in Silverwater Creek, Garrett James held his wife close and thanked whatever twist of fate had brought him to this town, to this woman, to this life that was richer and fuller than anything he could have imagined. And he knew with absolute certainty that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, step by step, in the dance they had begun that night and would continue for all the days to come. The years flowed by, each season bringing its own joys and challenges. The ranch prospered under Garrett's careful management, expanding to include more land and cattle. Samuel eventually sold his remaining share to Garrett, though he remained a frequent visitor and beloved grandfather figure to the James children. Silverwater Creek grew as well, transitioning from frontier outpost to established town. The railroad arrived when Grace was 10, bringing new opportunities for commerce and connection to the wider world. Rebecca's school expanded to a proper schoolhouse with 2 additional teachers, though she remained the heart of the educational community. Through it all, Garrett and Rebecca's partnership deepened. The passionate love of their early marriage matured into something equally powerful, but more nuanced: a profound understanding of each other's strengths and weaknesses, an ability to communicate with a glance or touch, a shared vision for their family and future. When Grace turned 16, Garrett found himself facing a challenge he hadn't anticipated: watching his daughter attend her first barn dance, accompanied by the son of a neighboring rancher. Standing on the porch of the Peterson barn, now owned by the Peterson's son, he felt a complex mix of pride and protectiveness as he watched Grace, auburn-haired like her mother but with his serious eyes, step onto the dance floor. "She'll be fine," Rebecca said, slipping her hand into his. At 42, she was still the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, the years adding character rather than diminishing her appeal. "Thomas Wilson is a good young man." "I know," Garrett acknowledged. "Just hard to see her growing up so fast." Rebecca laughed softly. "Says the man who taught her to ride at 3 and rope at 5. "That's different," Garrett protested. "Those are useful skills." "And dancing isn't." Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "As I recall, it worked out rather well for us." Garrett couldn't argue with that. Instead, he pulled his wife closer, grateful for the wisdom she brought to their partnership, the balance she provided to his more protective instincts. As they watched their daughter navigate her first steps into adulthood, Garrett reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From solitary drifter to husband, father, and respected rancher. From a man who refused to dance to one who had built his life around the woman who had taken his hand that night. "What are you thinking about?" Rebecca asked, noting his thoughtful expression. "How lucky I am," Garrett replied honestly, "and how different things might have been if you hadn't been so determined that night." Rebecca smiled, the same smile that still had the power to make his heart skip a beat. "Not determination," she corrected. Faith. I saw something in you that you couldn't see in yourself. I just had faith it was there. The music changed to a waltz, and without hesitation, Garrett led Rebecca onto the floor, past their blushing daughter and her young man, past Samuel and Martha, past friends and neighbors who had shared in their journey over the years. They moved together with the easy grace of long practice, their bodies remembering steps they had danced countless times before. And as they danced beneath the lantern light, Garrett James held his wife close and silently thanked her for her faith, for her courage, for taking the hand of a broken man and showing him how to live again. The cowboy who had refused to dance at the barn had never sat down again, and his life was immeasurably richer for it.